A woman was discovered dead in her own home. At first glance, investigators expected an easy explanation. But the more they looked, the more complicated the case became. What started as a routine investigation turned into something no one could have anticipated. In the end, the truth came to light. But the revelations were more shocking than anyone imagined. Randi Trimble was born on December 15, 1974, in Virginia. She was her mother's only child and was raised by her mom alone. From an early age, Randi showed a love for the arts. She played the flute, took part in school plays, and was active in the school band. After finishing high school, she enrolled at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania, where she pursued a degree in speech therapy. She had a deep passion for working with children and gave her studies everything she had. Her mother worked multiple jobs to help pay for her tuition. And Randi never took that sacrifice for granted. She worked hard to maintain excellent grades, and eventually earned a scholarship that covered her graduate studies in full. During college, she began dating a man named Brian. The two married shortly after graduation. But just before their wedding, they received devastating news. Brian was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a progressive illness that could cause long-term disability. Still, Randi stayed by his side, committing to support him no matter how the disease progressed. The couple settled in the quiet town of Camp Hill, where Randi secured a stable position at a local medical center. With her income, she bought a house, and together, she and Brian began to build a future. They dreamed of starting a family and started saving money, in case Brian's condition worsened and he couldn't work, to make sure they'd be financially secure. Randi even picked up a second job, despite already earning a good salary from her main position. January 10, 23, began like any normal day. Randi, who was 28 at the time, worked her shift at the hospital, then headed to her evening job afterward. She stayed there a few hours and eventually went home. Brian had finished his own workday earlier and had plans to meet a friend in a nearby town around 8 p.m. When he returned home later that night, he immediately sensed something was off. The house was dark, and Randi didn't seem to be there. Inside, the rooms were in disarray, items thrown around as if someone had been frantically searching for something. Brian looked through every room, calling out for her, but there was no response. Finally, he stepped into the garage, and that's where he found something truly horrifying. It was a devastating sight. Randi was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, a string of Christmas lights tightly wound around her neck. Brian immediately called 911, but it was already too late. When paramedics arrived, all they could do was confirm that she had died. The police handed Randi's body over to the coroner and began a thorough examination of the scene. But there were very few leads to follow. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear murder weapon, and nothing obvious that pointed to a suspect. Forensic teams gathered every fingerprint they could locate and sent them off to be analyzed, hoping one of them might identify the killer. They also found that some cash and a few of Randi's belongings were missing, including a gold ring with diamonds. Meanwhile, the medical examiner uncovered something disturbing. Randi had been stabbed 27 times. That's what ultimately ended her life. There were also marks that showed someone tried to strangle her, but failed to kill her that way. There were no indications of sexual assault. So at first, investigators believed this might have been a burglary gone wrong. One of the windows had been left unlocked, and detectives considered that the intruder may have gotten in through it. Still, the brutality of the attack suggested otherwise. The level of violence felt deeply personal. and detectives soon began to consider Randi's husband, Brian, as a possible suspect. Friends and relatives shared that the couple had been experiencing marital struggles, mainly related to Brian's health. Randi was constantly planning for the future, trying to save every penny in case Brian's illness progressed. Brian, however, didn't want to focus on what might go wrong. He felt they were living in constant fear, and that led to frequent disagreements. For investigators, that tension seemed like it could be a motive. But it didn't take long for Brian to be cleared. The medical examiner placed Randi's time of death around 7:30 p.m. At that moment, Brian was in another town, meeting a friend at a local CAF. Police verified his alibi. Multiple witnesses, including customers and staff at the CAF, confirmed that Brian had been there. Given the distance an hour's drive from their home, there simply wasn't enough time for him to leave, commit the crime, and return unnoticed. Randi's family also defended Brian, insisting there was no way he could have harmed her. And detectives had their doubts too. Brian's physical health was already beginning to decline, even though he was in the early stages of multiple sclerosis. He struggled with tasks that required physical strength. It seemed unlikely he could have carried out such a brutal attack. With Brian ruled out, investigators turned their focus elsewhere. But the lack of concrete evidence made the case nearly impossible to move forward. Forensic teams had come up empty. No usable fingerprints, no DNA, and no clear direction to pursue next. With no clear path forward, investigators turned their attention to the people who had been closest to Randi. Still convinced that the motive behind her murder was personal, they began interviewing her friends and colleagues. But no one could recall anyone who might have wanted to harm her. Randi didn't have enemies. In recent years, her life had revolved entirely around her home and family. As the weeks dragged on, the case remained at a standstill. There were no promising leads or additional suspects. So detectives reluctantly found themselves reconsidering Brian, even though his alibi had checked out. His behavior following Randi's death raised suspicions. Shortly after the murder, Brian moved to another city to be closer to his relatives. He started missing work regularly and completely cut ties with Randi's mother, even though they had once shared a close relationship. What really drew attention, though, was his sudden spending spree. Brian bought a new TV, a gaming console, furnished his new home with brand new items, and splurged on things that didn't appear necessary. His friends tried to confront him about the sudden lifestyle shift, but Brian brushed off their concerns with a strange comment. Grieving gets expensive. He also mentioned that he was expecting 2 insurance payments, one for the missing jewelry and another tied to Randi's passing. In the meantime, he said he was using the savings they had accumulated together. Brian's actions certainly raised eyebrows. But as long as his timeline remained solid, the police didn't have enough to take further action. So they chose to dig deeper and began speaking with his colleagues. Brian worked in IT at an insurance company, and detectives wanted to know if anyone at work had noticed anything odd. That's when they came across an intriguing lead. A woman who knew Brian fairly well told investigators that he frequently talked about marital issues at work. She said he often complained that Randi was overly controlling, always keeping track of their spending, and making him feel like he had no freedom. According to her, things had gotten so strained that just weeks before Randi's death, Brian was telling coworkers he was preparing to file for divorce. But then, without warning, he completely changed his story, saying everything was fine and that he and Randi were no longer considering separation. Before finishing the interview, the woman suggested investigators speak to someone else, a coworker Brian had been especially close to. That person was Blaine, another member of the IT department. The two had bonded over a mutual love for video games and horror films. In fact, Blaine had even written a script for a low-budget horror movie he hoped to produce someday. Something in the style of the Blair Witch Project. Brian had been fascinated by the idea, and the two often spent their workdays discussing it in detail. According to another coworker, something about Brian and Blaine's friendship had changed in the weeks leading up to Randi's murder. Their usual chats about video games and horror movies had suddenly stopped. Instead, they began speaking in hushed tones and isolating themselves, as if they didn't want anyone overhearing their conversations. This shift in behavior made investigators wonder if Blaine knew more than he was letting on. Still, rather than questioning him immediately, they decided to be strategic and tried to get more information from Brian first. Detectives maintained regular contact with Brian, checking in under the pretense of following up on minor details. He had grown used to their frequent questions, so when they asked him to return to the scene of the crime to walk them through the events of that night, he didn't hesitate. That's when things started to unravel. As Brian guided them through what happened the night Randi died, parts of his story didn't align with what he had said during his initial interview. Originally, Brian claimed he never touched Randi's body and called 911 as soon as he saw her. But now, he said he held her hand and cradled her in his arms. There were other inconsistencies too, minor discrepancies that caught detectives' attention. To them, it was a sign that something wasn't right. From that moment forward, the pressure was on. They kept close tabs on Brian, not just to gather more evidence, but to keep him on edge, constantly aware that he was being watched. They tapped his phone and shadowed him wherever he went, making no effort to hide their surveillance. This continued until detectives felt ready to push forward with the final part of their plan. In early May, 5 months after Randi's death, they brought Brian back in for another interview. This time, they were direct. They confronted him with everything they had, the contradictions in his story, his unusual spending, and the comments from his coworkers. Then one of the detectives said something that changed the entire tone of the conversation. "We know you didn't kill Randi, but we're also sure you know who did." That statement hit a nerve. After a long silence, Brian asked if his mother, who had accompanied him to the interview, could step outside. Once she left the room, he looked at the detectives and said he was ready to come clean, on one condition. They had to promise they wouldn't pursue the death penalty. The detectives agreed, and Brian began to reveal the truth. He admitted that things between him and Randi had deteriorated significantly. He said she constantly tried to control him, especially when it came to finances. He felt stifled and frustrated, like he couldn't enjoy anything or spend money the way he wanted. That resentment had been growing for years. Around that time, he formed a close friendship with Blaine, and became excited about a horror movie project Blaine was working on. Brian wanted to be part of it, and even helped with writing the script. The movie Blaine had written centered around 5 friends who embarked on a hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains. During their journey, they came across a deserted mining town where they unknowingly unleashed the vengeful spirit of a man who had died there. From that point on, the ghosts began hunting them one by one. Blaine and Brian had everything ready to begin filming, but there was one major hurdle: money. Even though they intended the project to be a low-budget indie film, they still needed a significant amount for things like equipment, paying actors, and other production costs. Blaine estimated they'd need over $10,000, and he didn't have the means to cover it. That's when Brian stepped in and offered to finance the film himself. He planned to dip into the joint savings he and Randi had built over time, funds she'd carefully set aside in case Brian's health deteriorated. His idea was straightforward: he'd invest in the film, help bring it to life, and hopefully catch the eye of a major studio. Once the film turned a profit, he'd repay the money with interest. But Randi wasn't on board. She was hesitant to risk their savings on such an uncertain venture, and more importantly, she didn't think it was wise for Brian to take part, considering his medical condition. The film would require days of filming deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far away from reliable medical access. In the end, Brian was forced to withdraw from the project, and Blaine wasn't thrilled. Still, he managed to find the money elsewhere, hired a small cast, and headed to the mountains to begin shooting without Brian. For about a week, Blaine filmed almost non-stop, and by all accounts, he was excited and deeply invested in the project. But underneath the surface, he was in serious trouble. To fund the shoot, Blaine maxed out every credit card he owned plus his wife's. She had no idea what he'd done until the bills arrived. When she realized he had racked up over $18,000 in debt, she left him and took their newborn child with her. Still clinging to the hope that the film would fix everything, Blaine pressed on. But now he couldn't even afford to edit the footage, let alone promote it. Without that, the movie was going nowhere. That's when Brian came back into the picture. He still wanted to be part of the film and offered to help finance its post-production. But one major obstacle remained: Randi. At that point, the two men began to consider a terrible possibility. How could they gain access to the savings she had refused to release? Eventually, they reached a chilling conclusion: the simplest way was to eliminate her. Over the following months, Brian and Blaine began carefully crafting what they believed would be a flawless crime. Drawing inspiration from the horror movies they both adored, they designed a plan that would make Randi's death appear to be the result of a home invasion gone wrong. Not only would it explain the crime, but it would also activate an insurance payout for the valuables that were allegedly stolen. They were counting on receiving $100,000 from Randi's life insurance policy. But to make the plan work, they knew Brian had to stay off the police's radar. On the day of the murder, both men left work early and went to Brian's house. There, they ransacked the place to make it look like a burglary had taken place. Afterward, Brian drove to a nearby town to meet a friend, creating an alibi while Blaine stayed behind, waiting for Randi to return home. When she came through the door, Blaine launched the attack. Initially, he tried to strangle her using a cord, but Randi fought back harder than he had anticipated. In the struggle, Blaine grabbed a knife and stabbed her multiple times. After the assault, he fled the house and disposed of the rubber gloves he had worn to avoid leaving evidence. Roughly an hour later, Brian returned, called 911, and claimed he had just discovered his wife's body. As Brian wrapped up his confession to the police, he said he hadn't expected the attack to be so vicious. He told them that when he met with Blaine a few days later, his friend had described every detail of the murder in disturbing depth, and the retelling made Brian physically ill. When investigators asked how he could do something so horrific to his own wife, a woman who loved him and had made plans for their future, Brian replied with chilling calm. He said he believed he was sparing her the emotional pain of a divorce. After that, Brian was formally arrested and placed in custody as he awaited trial. But for the detectives, the investigation wasn't over. Their next task was to build a strong enough case to implicate Blaine. Brian's confession alone wouldn't be enough in court. Investigators secured a warrant to search Blaine's vehicle. Inside, they found a receipt listing several suspicious purchases made on the day of the murder: rubber gloves, work gloves, black pants, and a black hoodie. They followed up by visiting the store and asking employees to check for any additional purchases made using the same credit card. Their major break came when the system showed that the same credit card had also been used to purchase a large knife. Detectives secured the exact same model of the knife and took it to the medical examiner, who confirmed that the blade was consistent with the wounds found on Randi's body. But just as things were falling into place, investigators hit an unexpected roadblock. After interviewing Blaine's acquaintances, they discovered he had an alibi. Two friends claimed Blaine was at his apartment around 7:30 p.m., roughly the time the murder occurred. If their account was accurate, it wouldn't have been possible for Blaine to commit the crime and return home in time. The friends also mentioned that after spending time with Blaine, they stopped at a gas station. Police obtained the receipt to verify the timing, and that's when they uncovered a critical detail. The timestamp on the receipt was 8:30 p.m., not 7:30. That meant Blaine did, in fact, have the time to carry out the murder and make it back to his apartment before his friends saw him. With the timeline corrected and the evidence finally aligning, detectives officially charged Blaine with murder and took him into custody. Up until then, police had very little direct contact with him. When officers showed up at his door, Blaine fainted immediately. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Blaine continued to insist he was innocent. But as the trial date approached and prosecutors revealed they would be pursuing the death penalty, Blaine changed course. To avoid capital punishment, he agreed to a plea deal. In his confession, Blaine admitted to killing Randi, explaining that he hoped to receive $20,000 from her life insurance to cover his mounting debts. Ultimately, both Blaine and Brian were sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. They remain incarcerated to this day. Following Randi's tragic death, her mother founded a nonprofit organization focused on supporting victims of domestic violence. The organization is still active today and has made a difference in the lives of hundreds of individuals seeking safety and support. If you found this story compelling and want to see more real-life cases like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing important and eye-opening stories. And if you never want to miss an update, make sure to hit the bell icon too. Thank you for watching. Your engagement truly means a lot.